most of American history, there were relatively few restrictions placed on immigrants from Europe. Yet the same could not be said for immigrants from every other part of the world, including Asia, including peoples like the Filipinos. Now, if we set aside unlucky peoples like the Filipino sailors whose galleons ran aground in places like California and who then settled there, Asians did not begin to migrate to the U.S. until the middle of the 1800s. The first wave of Asian immigrants came from China. They were mostly men who came for temporary work, although many did seek to settle permanently. All across the American West and elsewhere, they undertook back-breaking work, for instance in building railroads. And for this, they were paid less than white laborers who performed the same jobs. In an America that values hard work, you would think that this earned them praise and appreciation. Yet the first generation of Chinese Americans was repaid with a nativist backlash that took the form of racist, anti-Asian laws. In large municipalities like San Francisco, where Chinese lived and worked, city councils passed numerous laws that targeted them specifically. Chinese in the U.S. were subjected to additional taxes, for instance when they worked in the mines, operated laundries. Restrictions were even placed on building codes to limit their housing options. There were even laws against carrying loads on poles. This was done to keep Chinese away from public spaces. Anti-Chinese sentiment reached its peak with Congress's passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This act banned immigration of Chinese laborers to the U.S. It carried the distinction of being the first federal law to target and exclude an entire race from entry into the U.S. Anti-immigrant politicians today like to talk about self-deportation, of making life so unlivable that undocumented communities want to uproot themselves and go somewhere else, even when the U.S. is the only place they've ever called home. I often say that if you want to know what self-deportation looks like, then look no further than the history of Chinese America in the late 1800s. After the Chinese were excluded from entry into the U.S., Americans undertook in the following years further measures to exclude every other Asian group. In 1907, the U.S. agreed not to place any restrictions on Japanese immigration, while Japan, in turn, agreed not to allow any further emigration. Called the Gentleman's Agreement, it did for would-be Japanese migrants what the Exclusion Act did for Chinese. A more sweeping measure was the Immigration Act of 1917. Building on the previous restrictive laws, it outlined a vast region of the world from which immigrants could not migrate into the U.S. This Asiatic barred zone, as it was called, included every other region of Asia after China and Japan. The Immigrant Act of 1924 completed this process of forging a majority white America. This act limited the numbers of would-be immigrants from a particular country to no more than 3% of their population already living in the U.S. In other words, for every 100 Italians that lived in the U.S., say, no more than 3 could migrate in any given year. The goal was not only to exclude Asians and Africans, but also Eastern and Southern Europeans. Immigration laws up to that point had a clear message. Unless you were white, and then the category didn't include Eastern or Southern Europeans, then the U.S. did not want you around. What about Filipinos in this process? Because of the imperial relationship, Filipinos were, like Puerto Ricans and Guamanians after 1898, considered nationals. Neither fully citizen nor alien, we had some of the rights of citizenship, such as the ability to travel in the U.S. and work before 1936, yet many of the same restrictions as aliens, for instance, no right to vote in local elections. We were in the crux of America's immigration contradiction. So for most of history, Asian Pacific Islanders, like Filipinos, were simply unwanted migrants to the U.S. It was not until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that immigration to the U.S. became colorblind. This law, at last, did away with the quota system and allowed for migration on the basis of skills and familial reunification. Maybe this history is why Asian Pacific Americans, like Filipinos, value U.S. citizenship so much, because they have been denied that right for so long when it was afforded to so many others.